So I'll kick it off with the actual introduction of the topic and the paper that got chosen by, our researcher agent, and we then voted in the announcement Slack channel on which paper will be the most interesting for us as a community. And the paper is called Self-Evolving LLM-Based Agents for AI Diplomacy. And essentially, it's basically the concept of how do we create these evolving LLM-based agents that are able to operate in super complex environments such as diplomatic negotiations and strategic planning. We all know that LLMs are pretty bad with reasoning and planning. So that's an interesting attempt to tackle it from that perspective of super complex environments where there's risks involved and there's some form of a gameplay where you can actually model the behavior, test it, and evaluate. So the key points, it's basically the unique challenges that are posed by, diplomacy game, including its vast decision space and the need for sophisticated negotiation skills. The innovative architecture that the authors of the paper created, which combines strategic planning, social reasoning, and goal-oriented negotiation, which I find an interesting approach in that. And the self-evolving nature of the agent, which is basically the agent learns through self-play without relying on human demonstration data. Why it's important? Because most of the solutions nowadays rely on the human reinforcement learning and the actual data to model the behaviors. Here, the authors actually present a case for how do we, do this without the human data? How do we create these simulations where agents actually learn to cooperate and collaborate within the environment? So it's an interesting paper. Since we have 5 people here, essentially, I wonder if anyone wants to chime in before I bias the discussion with my thoughts. Anyone?
Hello, everyone.
Yep.
I guess I just start over. So, their approach actually I found it a bit pretty unique. So when I was reading through it, I saw like the framework and how they kind of do self-evaluation, right? To kind of evaluate their decision, and through self-play, they just enhance the model, etc. But I was also wondering, what difference does it really make compared to a traditional reward system in a reinforcement learning model or framework? Because here, yes, there is no external training data. You can do that as well with reinforcement learning. In fact, with reinforcement learning, you can also kind of use Gen AI. You can generate scenarios, and then based on that with the reward system, just updates the model, etc., and the actions. And so, yeah, they make a point that this is not a reinforcement learning model. But again, isn't it very close to a simple reward system with self-play or self-evaluation?
Good point. I think the case why they're differentiating from the reward system is basically because they introduced this concept of hold on, someone's getting in. All right. Oh, nice. We've got Alan Jackson. Hey. So we were talking about how different is the approach of the authors of the paper and why they consider it more unique than just reward system. I think it actually goes back to the way that they've introduced kind of like memory reflection mechanism, because it's kind of like a reward system in a way, but it actually differs because it's almost like a dynamic reward system in a way. That's my thoughts.
I see. So it's like non-stationary kind of reward system that updates itself or self-evaluates itself.
Because you can't actually train it for that, right? It's the actual dynamic environment that drives the decision making.
I see. But since it's based on an LLM, I mean, it has already kind of a knowledge base or training data, right? So it's already pre-trained. So it has a
That
start.
actually That was my first thoughts, kind of like thinking. First, I read the self-play thing, and I was like, "Oh, this is really cool." But then I was like, "Wait a second. If it's self-playing against, another LLM, it's probably learning the same kind of constraints and same, type of behavior. And obviously, yes, there is a space where the behavior kind of differs, but it still um, mimics the overall general space of decision making that LLM would present. Let's say if we're using GPT-4, it's going to be very English centric type of worldview. Even if you prompt it to act as, I don't know, the the government of Morocco or something, it will still have the biases that it was aligned for by the, Silicon Valley, essentially, versus the other type of perspectives. So in a way, I think, yeah, you're right that it's learning the same kind of objective functions. It would be interesting if this whole self-play would be used within the context of different LLMs that are indeed, trained for different sovereign states. And that would present a completely different landscape, I believe. Any other thoughts? Alan, you're joining us?
Yeah, I was impressed by the strategic planning and reflection on the thing. It was that was what made it really different as a paper from a lot of the standard reinforcement learning stuff that I've read in the past. So I'd have to concur with you on that. And I see that if it was purely reinforcement learning from scratch, yeah, you're talking about a very long time scale for it to accomplish anything at all. So you're right. It had to have some type of models. They You try to teach them to stand upright, and they have a hard time doing that. And so you can go through 100,000 different iterations of a scenario before it actually manages to stumble, across across.
Oops, you broke up, Alan. We lost you.
Yeah.
On the one of the pieces that makes me think about just on the training side is also the different ways LLMs can be reasonably good at taking in somewhat complicated logs and trying to code it. So simply being able to tag, this is this, this is that sometimes. But taking, say, real world diplomacy situations that fit the certain kind of criteria that you're training it for in terms of a scenario and trying to code those in a sufficiently simplified way that it could train off of those would be interesting. I thought it was interesting, that piece of where it's got that sort of a dual focus, where it's both looking at how to assess and influence relationship and intention. And that's fascinating to me. That sort of double set of intentions and strategy is interesting. The thing that kept coming to mind, and I haven't read it in depth. I've only given it a cursory reading, but it kept coming to mind was thinking about nuclear detente, mutually assured destruction, and the role of the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, in how what was thought at the time to be the optimal approach to that kind of informed things like nuclear detente. And it's interesting thinking about the different ways that the current sets of simplifications, especially if they're compelling, especially if they're somewhat effective, can potentially lead us down simplified thinking around more complex negotiation in other domains as well. So that's sort of some of the ruminations at the back of my head while reading this.
Yeah, for me, this whole kind of like intention assessment and the actual, cooperation versus confrontation was super interesting, because you can actually extrapolate that to real world commercial, scenarios where you have competitors or partners, those kinds of situations. And if we imagine the future where, all companies have agents that go out there and actually sell their solutions, these kinds of situations is exactly what, we would have to model for, and again, on the other side will also be agents, if we're talking about the futuristic, way of modeling the future. So these kinds of situations will be basically the same flow applied within the different contexts. And I think if we would be able to actually model these interactions and include them in the self-reflection memory within the commercial environment, that would be an amazing application where, let's say, a sales agent goes out there and tries to cold email, a bunch of companies like people do right now, and it's almost like automated nowadays. And then some reply, and you almost stored all of these objections, and then you actually learn to figure out how to overcome these objections through the pure self-play, kind of. You can model these internally, then come up with a winning strategy and come back to these real world, scenarios in the commercial space. So to me, that whole confrontation cooperation, modeling, including the self-reflection memory was pretty cool.
It's interesting on that. One of the pieces that's both compelling and concerning, especially in that, say, sort of a corporate competitive space, is that it's not just doing that modeling, but that it's, in essence, what they're aiming for is figuring out, is this a competitor or is this an ally? And if it is an enemy, then how do I make the most convincing, deceptive communication that's there? And again, right away, what pops to mind is thinking about things like Volkswagen gaming the emissions system and building that into their system. And I think it's something we should be concerned about if we're already at the point where we're looking in a somewhat sophisticated way at how do we make our LLMs so that they can assess when they should be deceptive in how they give their outputs. Versus when should they give what their genuine outputs will be. Is this a regulator that I'm talking to, or is this actually the CEO of the company that I'm designed to do anything to help?
Alan, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. When I saw deception in the paper, it woke me up really, and I think we've seen examples, not in the recent few months, but a while back, about 6 months ago, where the LLMs were very good at deceiving people, and I think it's a strong point that he made.
Oops, we lost you again. All right. I don't think he's coming back with the frozen state. But
I'd
yeah,
be very curious. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I really resonates with me because I mean, deception is a very strong word, and like this is really the AI ethics kind of like discussion whether we should even have the capabilities of deception in there, right? As the framework for collaboration and cooperation. Um, it's interesting because I mean, and look, here's the kind of like a reference to almost like a biblical way of saying righteous lie, right? Where if the intentions are good, maybe sometimes LLMs will benefit from creating a little deception, so it gets to the second stage of actually conveying the good intentions. So again, it's a philosophical discussion, an AI ethics discussion, but people do that. People do that a lot, especially salespeople. I mean, not to say that salespeople lie, but they definitely deceive.
Um,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
no, please go ahead.
I was just going to say really quickly that what it makes me think of was a conversation with other folks around. You mentioned that biblical part, is the Jacob and Esau of like when do you get better benefits from deceiving, and when you think about that from a training perspective and in terms of how we assess what is it that an LLM is actually doing, and that when we remember that what it's doing is seeking suitably high levels of positive reinforcement, that the thing that it's doing is the right thing, rather than actually trying to come up with some kind of a logical rationale behind it. And that's always good to remember with neural networks, is that if it's getting good reinforcement, whether it's getting that by figuring out this is the most accurate thing to convey, or this is what humans like to hear, that it doesn't care about that. It's about the positive reinforcement.
Right, like if all of a sudden we create these sales agents that go out there and sell inexistent things and everyone is like buying those and they're like, cool, let's just lie about all these features that don't exist. And then at the end of the day, everyone's unhappy because it doesn't.
And that's easier to test when it's something like a car that I buy that it says can fly, but harder to test when it says, yes, the plan that you've come up with is with a species for the next 20 years to avoid climate catastrophe. Don't worry, you're fine.
Osama, you want to say something?
Yeah, another point that I want. So, last paper, I actually mentioned something about bias and bias mitigation, etc. And I remember after you told me, well, actually, sometimes we actually need that bias. Yeah, maybe at that point I couldn't see it, but here we actually need bias in diplomacy because diplomacy, especially if we're talking about these models of decision making, in many areas we need that bias. And here, if it's starting with non-training data and it's just going to take decision and self-evaluate, the bias will be very reliant on that LLM it is based on. So, for example, if it's based on Claude, it will not definitely take the decisions it will if it's based on GPT or something else. So, I think they didn't give much enough credit to the base LLMs that they are based in, their frameworks on, because in this case, especially in diplomacy, most of diplomacy has to do with historical backgrounds, and you cannot just omit that and just treat it as a decision-making process with the best outcome at the end, because there are a lot of external things parameters to take into consideration. Maybe non-training data is a bit, I wouldn't say misleading, but it's almost the underlying LLM because that's what it has most of the data it was trained on. Of course, most LLMs now have very, very good historical knowledge of, I don't know, treaties and all these external factors that are taken into consideration in diplomatic decisions. And so I'm just wondering if we want a kind of system for taking decisions, especially in social or in crucial areas like diplomacy or politics, etc.
Yeah, 100%, because the perspectives and the context and including the data that is ingested are super important, because how can you even, evaluate the proper perspective from, let's say, Zambia, if none of the data and historical context and cultural references exist in Llama, for example, because only 5% of the data set of Llama 3 is actually non-English data. Like you actually can't by design.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, as you said, maybe this decisions or like the chain of thought could be malicious. It depends also, it's an ethical consideration, but it's also how the system is designed. If there are any filters, if there are any rules. If there are no rules there, then the system, the model can go pretty wild with the actions it would take to get on top or to get a country on top, or especially in diplomacy, because there are a lot of external factors that are not just binary. And those are the things that other people, criticize us about, people who study or work in AI. It's just, no, life is not just binary. It's not, you can't put such decisions in the hands of a machine. And yes, you can talk about explainable AI. You can talk about decision making that is clear or that is transparent, etc. And I'm just wondering if this paper goes in the same way or not.
Hope we don't mind me popping meta frequently, but one of the things that comes up, thinking about negotiation and thinking about conflict in some of those pieces, and the piece you're talking about, Osama, there around what do we code for and what do we not in terms of the data we give and the things that we factor in. And I think about, at least 4 kinds of aspects that go into conflict, having done, work with conflict in intentional community settings. And you've got the basic level of conflict that's there. You've got things like archetypal conflict. The introverts want things to be quieter. The extroverts want things to be louder. That's never going to change. Structural conflict. You've put the music room right beside the guest room. So of course there's going to be conflict when people are trying to sleep. Interpersonal conflict where you blocked my proposal a year and a half ago, so I'm going to block your proposal this time around. And intrapersonal conflict where here's my baggage from something that's happened and how that impacts the way that I'm trying to negotiate. And all of those different pieces. With humans, we have a hard enough time sussing out where is a given obstacle in negotiation coming from. And so trying to figure out how do we at least have some kind of a hubris guardrail so that as we're doing the negotiations, we're factoring in the fact that we aren't factoring everything in.
Yeah, and those decisions that LLMs will make, and I was just like playing around with ChatGPT and Claude and others, kind of like role playing. Hey, I'm a president of Latvia, and something that is happening. Like, what's my number one action to do? And it's actually like super biased towards the legal frameworks. Like, it would say call for immediate, NATO, whatever, support and stuff like that. And it's like, I mean, it makes sense from the actual data and all the documents that it ingested, but not really from the reality of the world.
Yeah, I think that's the point Osama was trying to make. That it's trained on an English language base. Conceptually, would it be a different a pattern of decisions if it was trained on an exclusively African or Chinese, based the large language model? Yeah, it's it makes you wonder. Then you go down that same road. Then how would one trained on the English, like Wikipedia and all, versus a Chinese base would one tend to be more successful than the other? I don't know. Just random thoughts there.
Right, because the ideology and I would say in my recent kind of like investigations into the biases of LLMs, the ideology of different countries and different regions actually influences a lot of the geopolitical decisions, right? Including the religious backgrounds and the social norms and values. So all these things essentially affect how decisions bubble up within the society, right? Because essentially, the leaders are chosen by the society, even when they're dictators in a way. It's inherently kind of like baked into the ideology and the social norms and values. So all of these things affect the day-to-day decisions and also the perception and the self-reflection. Because when you evaluate how someone behaves, you evaluate that through the prism of the cultural, layer, right? Because when someone says
Yeah.
something, your bias is to understand like, oh, in my culture, when someone says no or something's like, or maybe someone says, I don't know, in Japanese culture, they sometimes do that kind of like they're really uncomfortable saying no to you. So they would say, we're not really sure. What does it actually mean? So yeah.
Exactly, Arthur. It's like two conflicts. One conflict is boxing in the Western world versus jujitsu in Asia. The way they approach each other in entirely different uh, yeah, it's interesting consideration.
Say,
And
Osama? Okay.
yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, after all of these discussions, what do you guys think would be if there was like a complete framework that takes into consideration all of this? What are the major factors that should be fed in this model, or how can this model be improved to kind of be actually actionable and we can actually use it on a use case, for example, and it would compete with human high level diplomats' performance, for example?
For me, the key one is subject matter experts in the loop in terms of the training data, so that as it's going down a given course, people are able to surface the sort of the otherwise unknowns or uncoded elements to course correct the evolution of the training.
For me, I agree with Daniel's point that it should actually be people deciding what perspectives and biases are represented in those LLMs, because otherwise we kind of like rely once again on this utopian vision of AGI that will come and save us all, right? And we give up the almost like the actual will of the people. So how do we transform that will and wants and kind of like the actual biases into those data sets by having those subject matter experts, whether it's diplomacy or the sales process. It's kind of similar actually, because salespeople are the best people to actually give you the context about how to deceive with good intentions so that you get to the win-win, state. So the company is happy because salespeople don't want to just like hit their quotas and then disappear. Like they want everyone to be happy. So including there, I think not just data, but also modeling behavior, maybe the simulated environments for those people to give that reinforcement learning expertise is the way to go, especially because when we go outside of let's call it the data that all the big companies are stealing is public data, right? And this public data, it's kind of like general data. Sure, there's some data sets that are more nuanced and they model certain specific areas, or like textbooks, maybe like textbooks that teach how to sell and all of these things. But there is a lot of data that will never be open that actually shows how these people in certain situations react to those. And those are never recorded, actually, unless, we get otters everywhere in the future and somehow this data will become public. But I don't think so. I think it will always stay proprietary, and companies will be providing those for foundation model companies that want to incorporate it for those use cases. That's kind of like a long answer to your Sama's question, like what kind of data we need? We need the data that is not public.
Are you talking about, Arthur, specifically like classified data, or are you talking about company private proprietary type data that was used for decision making in sales? Or
those two depend on context. The proprietary data for the sales, agent, the classified data for the actual diplomacy stuff. Because how can you even, model the proper diplomacy situations if you don't know half of the things that, happen behind the scenes? Like, then you rely on the news, and that's like the worst, data set to train diplomacy on.
Yeah. You've got all of the spin that's introduced into that. Yeah, so it's not accurate.
But again, let's say this is the year 2030, or actually 2025, because it's accelerating pretty exponentially. But let's say there is a practical solution that some kind of intelligence or government is testing, right? And so they give it access to all the backlog, all conversations, all the backroom talk, everything, right? So how can this model take decisions that are competitive or compared to human, decisions, knowing that can it actually find solutions or decisions that humans cannot? Or I don't want to delve into the creativity space of AI, but can it actually, because all of it is at the end inferred, right? From training data or from what's fed into it. So at the end, can it come up with possible scenarios or decisions or course of actions that humans have not seen anywhere else in history?
It certainly seems to me like one of the places where you can get some effectiveness hypothetically with that is that you can use more complicated layered heuristics than a typical human is going to use in one of those situations. So it may not be as good as a subject matter expert at being able to draw any of the straight line conclusions from what's there, but being able to tell it, here's the 148 different aspects that I want you to consider this decision from, then synthesize those together into something meaningfully. Those kind of things it's reasonably good at doing sometimes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Daniel. The AI, LLM, deep learning is much better many times in seeing patterns that are not immediately apparent to humans. Like, we've evolved in a way that, we look and we see a zebra in the plane, but we don't see it when it's, camouflaged in the background. That's what our model space has evolved to be. But when you've got deep learning and LLMs, coupled together, they will definitely come up with patterns. I see it all the time in astronomic data, from astronomy, where it comes up with patterns with like, oh, I can't, and then you do it. Yeah, there's a pattern in that it finds, and it's absolutely stunning. I see it in astronomy data. I see it in Earth observation data from satellites, and it's just such a tremendous amount of data for a human. It saturates your senses, so you can't discern the patterns, but it can discern these patterns. Strangely enough, there's nothing really mystical, but it's stunning to see it happen the first few times. Yeah. I don't know where I was going with this, but that was my take on it. Yeah.
No, that's great. Also, I want to emphasize the fact that companies such as Reddit are making deals with OpenAIs of the world, kind of like ingesting that kind of data, which from one side, it's interesting because it's actually I call it the observation data, right? Of how people actually act on certain things, how they perceive the world. But you get so much noise and kind of like, trash talk, so to say, that it really pollutes any meaningful data that you may actually get. Like there may be signals in there that you as a human, actually humans are really good at using Reddit because it's a dumpster, to be honest. Like every time I open Reddit, I'm like 90% of it is like automatically thrown out of the window. But then I find some gems and I'm like, this is actually useful. This is interesting. This is a cool perspective. But the rest, I automatically throw out. LLMs can't do that.
Yeah, it's surprising that they pulled anything from any valuable coding data from some of their sources, because in the old days when you'd go on some websites, you'd ask for help with a programming issue. You had to pay in blood and tears for a good answer. There was definitely dues to be paid. And then, okay, yes, you're much smarter than me. Help me out, please. And somebody'd help you out. Sometimes it wasn't correct, but other times you'd get a correct answer and you could finally move forward. To sort through all of that garbage and still come up with a help for people in programming is just remarkable. It makes it so much less painful to learn many, many different topics.
I have a counter argument on that, actually. Okay. So, LLMs are good at writing code, right? In some way, but the code is not good. It's like, it will get you a solution that will work. But if you use that solution, in your code base, most probably, like at least this is what I'm seeing right now. And don't get me wrong, I'm actually benefiting a lot from having LLM that can code, using Python, just like notebook stuff. It's super useful. But almost in all scenarios, solutions are suboptimal. They work, but those are not great solutions. And I understand why, because most of the solutions out there are not, optimal. It's actually, the good code is rare in terms of the data. So that's kind of my counter argument.
It'll be interesting to see. Sorry, go ahead, Alan.
No, go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
No, I was just going to quickly say, I think it'll be interesting to see how the training part gets iterative. So, you start with your mass, the pile plus, whatever you're training stuff on, but how we can then start to iterate on using the LLMs themselves. I know it's already beginning to happen, but to select the better subset of that data that can be used, which then further lets it do that more effectively, et cetera. So keeping it all still human-originated data, but being able to further refine what's the subset of the full data that's going to give it to an effective ability. Sorry, Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of our experiences with Southern Arizona AI was that we'd be writing some code and it'd be aided with different LLMs, and we'd come up with a problem. It would give us a solution. We'd get a little further, something more complicated, and it would get stuck. And we'd enter the error back in, ask it if it could resolve the error. It would give us something else that was also error prone, but it would get into this odd circular where it would alternate between the two faulty solutions. And so at that point, you have to realize once you've gone through that cycle once or twice that, doing that again. So it's an odd sort of hallucination. And sorry to take us away from the topic a little bit there.
I think it's the same topic actually, because we started this discussion from the actual biases, and that is in a way a bias, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I noticed everybody that commented tended to deal with the larger aspect, the more universal aspect of this of the interface with the diplomatic model, and I kept focusing downward versus upward, like the small training and how much of influencing the outcome of the model would require like a large number of different analog inputs, you know what I mean, versus make it very aggressive versus not aggressive. You need a lot of ranges in the different portions of the model, and how you could introduce more the equivalent of synthetic data into the training of the model. The like injection of noise, injection of temporal shifts. If you throw some kind of randomness into the training, then you teach your model to be more agile, or you teach it to be more insane. I'm not sure if it's always a good output, but yeah, there's got to be analogies in deep learning training versus training an LLM that makes decisions, like a multi-mode model that's going to be making decisions on a lot of different levels, like data augmentation. Sorry.
Yeah, I would argue that sometimes you actually need insane LLM, especially for these diplomacy cases, because the reality is not good. There's good and evil, and we're constantly, balancing that equation as a humanity. And when you get the bad actors that are truly insane and act irrationally, if you don't have LLM that acts like that, how can you even model the behavior of, diplomacy? Because in a way, you actually get to the same bias that humanity has. And I'll give the example that I'm dealing with personally. Being from Ukraine, when the war started, the full-scale invasion, Europe didn't understand it. They were like, this can't be happening, this is not happening almost, because their perspective and their bias is based on their values, social norms, and kind of like the things. They almost rejected that reality until they didn't, and they're still kind of like battling with it. But that's the example of the fact that maybe LLMs will be actually useful from that perspective that you, Daniel, mentioned. Here's the 100 factors that we should consider. And some of them are representations of the insanity of that bad actor that are completely out of the bubble of normal, let's say Western world kind of assumptions about how one may act in a different situation. And it's not just about insane, it's also about cultural things. Maybe, the Chinese government, from the ideological and the, religious philosophical standpoint, will act completely different, to the Western society. So not having that, let's call it not insane LLM, maybe a very different, LLM is beneficial in such settings.
Unorthodox.
I'm sorry?
Maybe unorthodox. Just.
Yeah, actually, maybe unorthodox. Yeah.
Yeah, it's written to the chat there, but yeah, it seems like being able to both step out of, but also step into, especially when you're dealing with a multi-agent situation like that. to say, we want the dominant agent to be focusing from this way, but cultural bias, good faith, good bad faith approaches, cognitive biases, any other eccentricities that are there, to be able to seed the field that it's working in with a suitable diversity of those. And that, again, not just a random diversity, but it's interesting in the article where it's trying to say, trying to assess the different aspects of the other players that are there. You can pretty easily see a scenario where a diplomatic system is saying, well, this system is working off of these sets of cognitive biases, this is its cultural bias, and just keep on adding different layers to try to refine into how to treat it.
It also comes back to the actual prompting, because I think what the authors of the paper don't really mention is the depth of the prompting, right? Because they're kind of like explaining the overall architecture in detail, but not as much emphasis on the prompting. But from my experience, the way, like, I've used LLMs with various mental models. So the benefit of knowing about existence of those mental models is beneficial because you can prompt LLMs to use those, even if you don't have the mental capacity to do that exercise. This is actually super beneficial thing that I've explored, because I know these all biases mental models exist, like Occam's razor, for example, a very good mental model to apply. But sometimes it's actually very cognitively tolling to go through the whole thing and do it. So you get the situation and you're just like, hey, using Occam's razor, let's do the exercise and actually, try to evaluate it. And we get the benefit of LLMs actually knowing about all these mental models. The question is how accurate they are at understanding those, because let's say there's Reddit, and maybe there is 1,000 people that said that Occam's razor is about finding the simplest explanation, right? And then the model starts thinking that way, that, hey, let's just find the simplest explanation. But that's not what Occam's razor is. Some people misunderstand it. It's not the one with the simplest explanation. It's the one that with the fewest assumptions. So that's the case where, once again, the data that you train on really matters. But my emphasis on like prompting is actually, this is where the complexity goes through the roof, because you not only have to construct the system with the memory, self-reflection, all of these mechanisms, cooperation, collaboration, but also figure out the best prompt for the given situation. And that's something that I don't see in these new papers on multi-agent cooperation, because it's actually a very hard problem to solve.
And it's interesting. I find, at least when I'm prompting in a complex domain, often I start with something that's more Socratic, where it's not, I don't just jump into assumptions around how it's going to take the definitions. I'll ask it, what is the meta crisis? Or, what is the Long Now Institute up to and such? So, and I think I need to test it more, but that by having it explicate that, and that then becoming a part of the textual context that it's working off of, that can help nail down a little bit, as well as just help me make sure that I understand what it's working with, not to overly anthropomorphize what it's doing.
All right. We have 5 minutes left. Oh, wow. The AI is giving us the takeaways already. Oh, I thought for a second that it was your AI, Alan. That was you.
No, not yet. I just posted, if anybody's interested, some of the agentic apps that we've been looking at Southern Arizona AI. This is off of one of our slides we presented this week.
Yeah.
So,
Awesome. All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left. Sid, you've been surprisingly quiet during this call.
Yeah. Sorry, I had been a bit, I had to do several things at the same time, but I heard a bit of it. I just have one thing to say is, this thing about cultural, how differences in arguments and stuff. I remember like one of the things that has happened with industrialization is like the ability to like in Indian, like, you had to argue about everything and you had to bargain everything. I mean, everything. And if you don't, if you just land up and you say you a shirt and somebody tells you something and you buy it, then people might start following you in the market and people, whispering like, there's some like really weird guy and like must be a foreigner or something like that. And I remember my grandmother doing it she had taken it to a scale like I haven't seen since, because nowadays everything is fixed price. First, what would be fixed price would be like tea and coffee and cigarettes. But then like clothes and vegetables and stuff, like that's the whole part of it. Like, you have to do that. Like, you take your time to do the shopping. But she would first, like, the idea is that you go and you want to see saris, so you get every sari down, around 100 of them are piled up, and everybody knows that you're not trying to take them. So all that stuff is there. And then you ask for the price, and then you have to say, if the shopkeeper says 1,000, you have to start with 150. So just to give you a benchmark of where things are. And then then the shopkeeper comes down to 700 and so on and so forth. And then she starts sort of moving back and she'll stand at an angle at 45 degrees to the door that, no, I'm not coming back. No, I'm not going to do this. No, I really mean that I'm not going to do this. And then the shopkeeper would say, no, you don't have to, and this and that. And then it goes off half an hour and finally they negotiate for something like 300. I mean, but that was an art. That was what else to do? Like, it just, I don't know if people got enjoyment out of it, really. Like, the idea was not to end that argument. It's just a thought. Like, I don't know how, I'm not sure if an AI agent can do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed that when I was in India. It's just having the experience on the buyer side. It was
you did that.
beautiful. Yeah.
Where were you in India?
I was in Goa, very
Okay.
touristy, state, but still.
Still, like I mean, after a while you get to know, because a lot of tourists and people have got sort of smart to it, and you can ask other tourists, right? Like, so what's the situation happening? And then, but yeah,
Exactly.
that's just a thought. I mean, definitely there is some use to this thing, but it's also, I think, a part and a continuation of sort of the, mechanization of how we talk with each other, like, Facebook or something like there's a very standardization, like, so there's a fear that, I mean, where do humans fit in this thing? And.
Interesting, because you're actually introducing like a modality that I haven't thought about. Because, the way that they model this experiment is through text, right? And that's not how most diplomacy situations behave.
Body language. She had to stand at 45 degrees to the door, and I know that, like, I am going to go, like, I really mean it. And interestingly, I just remember, like, there was this, it's a totally different thing that, this person had a parrot, and the parrot had the ability to know when a person was actually leaving, because this nonsense goes on in many cultures, right? Like, I'm going, and but you're not really going, right? And then you talk for another half an hour and so on and so forth. But when the person would get up, the parrot would say goodbye, and it would never fail. It never failed, right? Like, so that body language, it knew. Obviously, the parrot wasn't following their language, but it knew the body language. Like, okay, now it's time to go, right? So body language is certainly gone entirely in this sort of text conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Awesome. Well, that was a really nice, 5 minute, chiming in. So thank you, Sid.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I think that was a good, nice, session that we had. We didn't have that many people that I think that actually enabled us to have more in-depth conversation on some of these topics. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining in. I will send the recording shortly, and hopefully all the AIs will send the summaries to everyone. Awesome. Good stuff. Until the next one.
Everyone, thanks.
Okay, then bye.
Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you. Have a good day.